in the unforgiving heart of the West, where desperation is a currency and hope a fool's gold, a man can lose everything he's ever held dear. Jedediah. A father hollowed out by grief knew this better than most. His life was a dust bowl of sorrow until a single desperate act of kindness brought a stranger to his door. A 19-year-old girl with eyes that held the secrets of 1,000 miles, sold like cattle by her own kin. He offered her shelter, a roof over her head, never suspecting that this child of the dust, this abandoned soul, was not a burden to be carried, but the miracle that would lead him back into the light. This is a story of redemption, of a love that blooms in the harshest of landscapes, and of the stunning, life-altering truth that sometimes the one you save is the one who ultimately saves you. The town of Perdition, Arizona was aptly named. It clung to the scorched earth like a scab, a festering collection of clapboard and canvas baking under a relentless, unforgiving sun. For Jedediah Kane, it was both home and his own personal purgatory. The dust of the high desert had settled into the lines on his face, mirroring the fine layer that coated every surface of his modest, lonely cabin on the edge of town. It was a dust that tasted of regret and smelled of the sweat and toil of a man wrestling with a life that had taken far more than it had ever given. 2 years. It had been 2 years since the fever had stolen his Mary. Her laughter and warmth replaced by a silence that echoed in the single room of their home. And 6 months after that, it had claimed his son, little Thomas, whose small hand had once fit so perfectly in his own. Now all Jedediah had left was a 6-year-old daughter, Clara, a fragile bloom in a garden of thorns. Clara was his reason for waking, his reason for breathing the dry, dusty air of a world that had become as barren as his heart. Clara was a quiet child, her mother's deep brown eyes often wide with a solemnity that no child should possess. She played with corn-husk dolls and spent hours tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick, her small world confined to the shadow of their small homestead. Jedediah watched her with a fierce, aching love, a constant fear, a cold knot in his stomach. He was failing her. The ranch, once a place of hope, was now a testament to his struggle. The fences were in a constant state of disrepair. The small herd of cattle was dwindling, and the credit at the general store was stretched as thin as a whisper. He was a man drowning in slow motion, the weight of his grief and the crushing responsibility of single fatherhood pulling him under. The townsfolk of Perdition, a mix of hardened miners, opportunistic gamblers, and weary settlers, saw his struggle. They offered platitudes and the occasional pitying glance, but in a place where survival was a daily battle, every man was an island. Sheriff Brody, a man whose gut strained the buttons of his shirt, would sometimes stop by his words of encouragement, as empty as the pockets of most of the town's inhabitants. "You're a good man, Jedediah," he'd say, his eyes avoiding Jedediah's. "The Lord tests the righteous." Jedediah had stopped believing in such tests. He believed in the harsh reality of the sun, the stubbornness of the earth, and the gnawing loneliness of a bed that was too big for one man. One sweltering afternoon, as the sun began its slow, merciless descent, casting long, skeletal shadows across the landscape, Jedediah rode his weary mare Bess back from a futile search for a stray calf. His shoulders slumped with the familiar weight of defeat. As he approached the outskirts of Perdition, he saw a commotion near the saloon, a place he assiduously avoided. A small crowd had gathered, their voices a low, rumbling murmur. Curiosity, a feeling he hadn't experienced in months, pricked at him. He dismounted, tying Bess to a hitching post, and moved closer, his worn boots kicking up small puffs of dust. In the center of the circle stood a man Jedediah recognized with a jolt of revulsion. Silas Croft, a man with a face like a clenched fist and eyes as cold and hard as river stones. Croft was a drifter, a man who dealt in whispers and shadows, his reputation as foul as the cheap whiskey he perpetually smelled of. Beside him, cowering like a frightened deer, was a young woman. She couldn't have been more than 19, her dress torn and stained with the grime of a long journey. Her hair, the color of sun-bleached straw, was a tangled mess, and her face, though smudged with dirt, held a delicate beauty that seemed achingly out of place in the harsh glare of the Arizona sun. But it was her eyes that snared Jedediah's attention. They were a startling, crystalline blue, and in their depths he saw a fear so profound, so absolute, that it resonated with the hollow spaces in his own soul. "Step right up, gentlemen." Croft's voice was a greasy drawl, slithering through the dry air. A rare opportunity. A fine, healthy girl, strong and willing. Her folks, good, God-fearing folk back east, sent her out here to make a new life. A small indenture, a pittance really for a guaranteed worker. She can cook, clean, tend to other needs. He ended with a lecherous wink that made Jedediah's stomach turn. A murmur went through the crowd. Some men laughed, their eyes raking over the girl with a predatory hunger. Others, men with wives and daughters, shuffled their feet. Their discomfort a palpable thing. It was a scene as old as the dust, a transaction of human flesh as common as a card game. But for Jedediah, something snapped. He saw not a commodity, but a child, a girl not much older than his Mary had been when he'd first courted her. He saw the same terror in her eyes that he imagined must have been in his own when the doctor had shaken his head, his face a mask of grim finality. Before he could think, before the familiar crushing weight of apathy could settle back over him, he found himself pushing through the crowd. The men parted, their surprise evident on their sun-beaten faces. Jedediah Kane, the silent, grieving rancher, was a man who kept to himself, a ghost haunting the edges of their town. How much Jedediah's voice was raspy from disuse, but it cut through the murmuring. Croft's eyes, small and piggy-narrowed. He looked Jedediah up and down, a sneer playing on his thin lips. "Well, well, look what the cat dragged in. Kane, I didn't figure you for this kind of sport." Jedediah ignored the jibe, his gaze fixed on the girl. "I asked you a question, Croft." Croft's sneer widened, revealing a set of yellowed, crooked teeth. "For you, Kane, a special price. $50. $50. The number hit Jedediah like a physical blow. It was a fortune, more money than he had seen in months. It was the money he had painstakingly saved coin by agonizing coin for the new bull he desperately needed if his ranch was to have any chance of surviving the winter. It was Clara's future. He felt 100 pairs of eyes on him, felt their judgment, their pity, their morbid curiosity. He could feel the familiar pull of despair, the urge to turn, to walk away, to retreat back into the numb safety of his grief. But then the girl looked at him. Her blue eyes, wide and pleading, met his, and in that fleeting connection he saw a flicker of something he hadn't seen in a long, long time. A desperate, fragile sliver of hope. He thought of Clara alone in their cabin, her world already so small, so shadowed by loss. What kind of a man would he be if he walked away, leaving this girl to a fate worse than death? What kind of a father would he be if he taught his daughter that a human soul was worth less than a bull? With a resolve that surprised even himself, he reached into the worn leather pouch at his belt. His hand trembled as he counted out the coins, the silver and copper a heavy, damning weight in his palm. He thrust the money at Croft, the coins glinting in the fading light. "She's not for your kind of work," Jedediah said, his voice low and firm. "She'll be a companion for my daughter, a governess." Croft snatched the money, his eyes gleaming with avarice. He licked his lips, his gaze lingering on the girl. "A governess? In that dusty shack of yours? Whatever you say, Kane, she's all yours." He gave the girl a rough shove, and she stumbled forward, nearly falling at Jedediah's feet. She looked up at him, her eyes a mixture of terror and disbelief. Jedediah simply nodded, his face a grim, unreadable mask. He turned without another word, the girl trailing behind him like a shadow. The crowd parted for them, their whispers following him like a swarm of angry bees. He could feel their stares on his back, a mixture of derision and grudging respect. He didn't care. For the first time in a long time, he had made a choice that wasn't dictated by grief or despair. He had acted. He helped the girl onto Bess, his touch gentle, and then mounted behind her. He could feel her trembling, her small frame rigid with fear. He didn't speak, didn't offer any words of comfort. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions and fears. As they rode out of perdition, the last rays of the sun painting the sky in hues of blood and fire, Jedediah looked back at the town, a collection of broken dreams and desperate souls. He had just spent his last hope on a stranger, a girl with no name and a past shrouded in shadows. He didn't know if he had just made the biggest mistake of his life, or if in the heart of his own desolation, he had just stumbled upon a miracle. All he knew was that for the first time in a very long time, the silence in his soul was not one of despair, but of a quiet, terrifying anticipation. The dust of perdition settled behind them, and for the first time, Jedediah felt the faint, unfamiliar stirrings of a new and uncertain dawn. The ride back to the cabin was a silent one, the only sounds the rhythmic plodding of Bess's hooves and the chirping of crickets heralding the arrival of night. Jedediah was acutely aware of the girl's presence, her back pressed against his chest, her shallow breaths a testament to her fear. He was a man unused to such proximity, his world having shrunk to the small, familiar orbit of his daughter. Now a stranger, a complete unknown, was a part of that world, and the weight of his decision settled upon him with a suffocating intensity. When they arrived at the cabin, a single lantern cast a warm golden glow from the window. Clara. She would be waiting for him, her small face pressed against the glass. A pang of guilt, sharp and familiar, pierced through him. How would he explain this? How would he introduce this stranger into their fragile, carefully constructed world? He dismounted, then gently helped the girl down. She stood before him, her head bowed, her hands clasped in front of her as if in prayer. In the dim light, she looked even younger, more vulnerable. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer than he intended. She flinched at the sound of his voice, then looked up, her blue eyes wide and luminous in the twilight. "Sarah." She whispered, her voice so faint he barely caught it. "Sarah." He repeated the name, feeling foreign on his tongue. "Well, Sarah, this is it." He gestured to the small, rustic cabin, the symbol of his failures and his resilience. As if on cue, the cabin door creaked open, and Clara stood silhouetted in the doorway, her small form a beacon in the encroaching darkness. "Papa." Her voice was a small, hopeful question. Jedediah's heart ached. He walked towards her, Sarah trailing a few steps behind. He knelt down so he was at eye level with his daughter. "Clara, sweetheart." He began, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. This is Sarah. She's going to be staying with us for a while. She's going to be your friend." Clara's gaze shifted from her father to the strange woman standing in the shadows, her brow furrowed in a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Sarah, for her part, remained silent, her eyes fixed on the ground. The first few days were a study in awkwardness and silence. Sarah was a ghost in their small home, moving with a quiet, almost apologetic grace. She did as she was told, her movements efficient and precise, but she rarely spoke her answers to Jedediah's questions clipped and monosyllabic. She seemed to be holding her breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the kindness he had shown her to curdle into something else, something she was more familiar with. Jedediah, for his part, was at a loss. He was a man of action, a man who understood the language of the land of cattle of the seasons. The delicate, nuanced language of a traumatized young woman was a foreign tongue to him. He watched her from a distance, his heart a tangled mess of pity, frustration, and a strange protective instinct he hadn't felt since Mary's passing. Clara, however, was a different story. Children with their untarnished hearts and unfiltered curiosity often see what adults blinded by their own pain and prejudice cannot. She was initially wary of Sarah, her loyalty to her father, and the memory of her mother a fierce protective shield. But Sarah's quiet gentleness, her almost reverent stillness, slowly began to chip away at Clara's reserve. One afternoon, Jedediah returned from a long day of mending fences to find a scene that brought him to a halt in the doorway. Clara was sitting on the floor, her cornhusk dolls arranged around her, and Sarah was kneeling beside her, her head bent low. At first he thought something was wrong, that Clara was hurt. But then he heard it, a sound so unexpected, so foreign in their silent home, that it took him a moment to identify it. Laughter. It was a soft, melodious sound, like the tinkling of a hidden spring. And it was coming from Sarah. She was weaving a crown of wildflowers for one of Clara's dolls, her nimble fingers a blur of motion. And Clara, his quiet, solemn. Clara was watching her with an expression of pure, unadulterated delight. From that day on, a subtle shift occurred in the small cabin. The silence, once heavy and oppressive, began to lighten, to breathe. Sarah's presence, once a source of tension and uncertainty, became a quiet, comforting hum in the background of their lives. She began to speak more, her voice, though still soft, losing its hesitant, fearful edge. She told Clara stories of a world beyond the dusty plains of Arizona, of green hills and rushing rivers, of a life that seemed a world away from the harsh realities of perdition. Jedediah found himself drawn into their small, burgeoning world. He would sit by the fire in the evenings, ostensibly mending a harness or sharpening a tool, but his attention would be fixed on Sarah and Clara, their heads bent together over a book or a game of checkers. He found himself smiling a genuine, unforced smile that reached his eyes, a sight so rare that even Clara would sometimes stare at him in surprise. Sarah, it turned out, was a natural with Clara. She had a patience that bordered on saintly, a gentle, unwavering kindness that seemed to soothe the raw, unhealed wounds of Clara's grief. She taught Clara her letters, her numbers, her voice, a soft, steady murmur in the quiet of the afternoon. She taught her how to bake bread, their laughter filling the small kitchen as they kneaded the dough, their hands covered in flour. But it was in the small, everyday moments that Sarah's true miracle began to unfold. She had a way with animals, a gentle touch that seemed to calm the most skittish of creatures. The chickens, once a squawking, chaotic flock, would now gather around her, clucking contentedly as she scattered their feed. Bess, his old, cantankerous mare, would nuzzle her hand, a sign of affection she rarely bestowed on anyone, including Jedediah. And then there were the plants. The small, pathetic patch of land behind the cabin, where Mary had once tried and failed to cultivate a garden, had been a constant, painful reminder of his loss. He had let it go to ruin the weeds and thorns, a reflection of the desolation in his own heart. But Sarah, with a quiet determination that was becoming her trademark, began to tend to it. She would spend hours under the hot sun, her hands in the dirt, her face smudged with soil. Jedediah watched her, a mixture of skepticism and a reluctant, burgeoning hope. To his astonishment, under her gentle, patient care, the barren patch of earth began to transform. Small green shoots began to poke through the soil, then unfurl into leaves, then burst into a riot of color. Tomatoes, plump and red, hung from the vines like jewels. Corn stalks, tall and proud, reached for the sky, and flowers, a vibrant, fragrant profusion of them, bloomed in every corner. Their beauty, a startling, defiant splash of life against the muted, dusty landscape. The garden became a source of wonder, not just for Jedediah and Clara, but for the whole town. People would stop by, their faces a mixture of disbelief and envy, to marvel at the impossible oasis of green in the heart of the desert. They would ask Sarah for her secrets, and she would simply smile, her blue eyes sparkling with a light that seemed to come from within. Jedediah knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that this was no ordinary garden. It was a miracle. And Sarah, the quiet, unassuming girl he had bought for $50, was the source of it. But with this growing realization came a new, unsettling question. Who was Sarah? Where did she come from? What was the story behind the fear he had seen in her eyes that day in perdition? The questions gnawed at him, a constant low-grade hum of unease beneath the surface of their newfound peace. One evening as they sat by the fire, the comfortable silence of their routine was broken by a sudden violent thunderstorm. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling the windows and shaking the small cabin to its foundations. Clara, who had always been terrified of storms, whimpered and buried her face in Jedediah's side. But it was Sarah's reaction that truly unnerved him. She had gone pale, her eyes wide with a familiar, gut-wrenching terror. She was trembling, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. She was not just afraid of the storm. She was reliving a trauma, a memory that was as real and as terrifying as the wind and rain lashing against their small home. He moved to her side, his hand hovering over her shoulder, unsure of how to comfort her. "Sarah," he said, his voice gentle. "It's just a storm. We're safe here." She looked at him, her eyes wild with a fear that was not for the storm, but for something else, something from her past. "He used to lock me in the cellar," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. "When he was angry, when the storms came." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. "He..." Jedediah prompted, his heart pounding in his chest. Sarah's story, when it finally came, was a torrent of pain and betrayal, a story that explained the fear, the silence, the quiet, desperate hope he had seen in her eyes. She was not an indentured servant. She was the daughter of a wealthy, influential man back east, a man who had a dark, violent side that he kept hidden from the world. Her mother, a woman broken by years of abuse, had been powerless to protect her. When Sarah had finally found the courage to defy him, to refuse to marry a man of his choosing, a man as cruel and as violent as he was, her father had sold her to Silas Croft, a man who specialized in making inconvenient people disappear. The story was a punch to the gut, a brutal, ugly truth that shattered the fragile peace they had built. Jedediah listened, his heart aching with a rage so fierce it stole his breath. He looked at this young woman, this girl who had brought so much light and life into his home, and he saw the scars of a life he could barely imagine. As the storm raged outside, a new, more dangerous storm was brewing within the small cabin. The secret was out, the truth revealed, and with it came a new, terrifying reality. Silas Croft was not just a drifter, a purveyor of human misery. He was a man who knew Sarah's true identity, a man who held a secret that could destroy her, and in doing so, destroy the new life they had so carefully, so tentatively begun to build. Jedediah knew with a cold, sinking certainty that Croft would be back, and when he came, he would not be coming for $50. He would be coming for the truth, and Jedediah, the grieving, broken rancher from perdition, would have to find the strength to fight for the miracle that had been delivered to his door, a miracle that was now in more danger than ever before. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was coming for them, and this time there would be no cellar to hide in. This time they would have to stand and fight. The revelation of Sarah's past hung in the air of the small cabin long after the storm had passed, a palpable entity as real as the scent of damp earth and the lingering smell of ozone. The quiet peace they had cultivated felt fragile now, a delicate glass sculpture threatened by a gathering tremor. Jedediah found himself watching Sarah with a new understanding, the pieces of her puzzle clicking into place. The flinching at loud noises, the initial bone-deep fear in her eyes, the way she could make herself so small, so unobtrusive. It was the language of survival, a dialect he was only now beginning to comprehend. A cold, hard fury simmered in Jedediah's gut, a feeling he hadn't experienced with such intensity since the day the doctor had given him the news about Mary. It was a protective rage, a primal instinct to shield the small, precious world he had begun to rebuild. He looked at Clara, now sleeping soundly in her small bed, a picture of innocence, and then at Sarah, who was staring into the dying embers of the fire, her face a mask of old pain and fresh anxiety. He had brought this danger to his door, however unintentionally. The $50 he had paid Croft was not a purchase price, but a down payment on a conflict he now knew was inevitable. Perdition was no place to hide a secret. The town thrived on gossip, its tendrils as invasive and persistent as the mesquite roots that cracked the dry earth. Sarah's miraculous garden was already the subject of whispers and speculation. Now, with the knowledge of her true identity, Jedediah felt as if they were living in a house of cards, the slightest breeze threatening to bring it all tumbling down. The days that followed were thick with a quiet tension. Jedediah took to wearing his Colt Peacemaker, the worn leather of the holster, a familiar, comforting weight against his hip. He had always been a man of peace, his skill with a rifle used for hunting, not for settling disputes. But the thought of Silas Croft, of the leering, predatory look in his eyes, stirred a violence in him that was both frightening and necessary. He tried to act as if nothing had changed for Clara's sake. They maintained their daily routines, the mending of fences, the tending of the small herd, the lessons and chores in the cabin. But there was an undercurrent of urgency, a sense of borrowed time. He found himself scanning the horizon more frequently, his eyes searching for the telltale plume of dust that would signal an approaching rider. Sarah, too, was changed. The tentative bloom of her spirit, which had begun to unfold in the safety of their home, seemed to have retreated, its petals curling inward. The laughter still came, especially when she was with Clara, but it was softer now, more fragile. The light in her eyes was often dimmed by a shadow of fear. One afternoon, as Sarah and Clara were tending to the garden, a lone rider did appear on the horizon. Jedediah's hand went instinctively to his gun, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. But as the rider drew closer, he recognized the portly figure of Sheriff Brody, his horse looking as weary and overburdened as its owner. Brody dismounted, his face a mixture of official business and personal curiosity. He tipped his hat to Sarah, his eyes lingering on the impossible bounty of the garden. Afternoon, Jedediah. Sarah. He said, his voice a low rumble. Quite the green thumb you got there, ma'am. Sheriff Jedediah said, his voice tight. What can I do for you? Brody's gaze shifted from the garden to Jedediah, his eyes narrowing slightly. Just making my rounds. Heard a rumor Silas Croft was back in the territory. A nasty piece of work, that one. Thought I'd warn folks to be on their guard. The words, meant as a neighborly warning, landed like a physical blow. Jedediah's blood ran cold. He was here. Croft was back. We'll be careful, Sheriff Jedediah said, his voice a low growl. Brody nodded, but he didn't leave. He seemed to be studying them, a shrewd, calculating look in his eyes. You know Kane? He said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. A man like Croft, he don't just show up for no reason. He's usually sniffing around something valuable. A gold claim, a hidden stash, or a secret. The implication was clear. Brody knew something, or at least he suspected. The whispers in perdition had reached his ears. Jedediah met the sheriff's gaze, his own eyes hard and unyielding. We're simple folk out here, Sheriff. We ain't got nothing of value. Brody grunted a non-committal sound. He looked at Sarah again, a long, appraising look that made Jedediah's hackles rise. You take care of that. Governess of yours, Kane. Some things are worth more than gold. With that, he tipped his hat again and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and a thick, suffocating silence in his wake. The sheriff's visit was a turning point. The threat was no longer a distant, abstract possibility. It was a tangible presence, a shadow lurking just beyond the edge of their small homestead. Jedediah knew he couldn't face it alone. He was a rancher, not a gunslinger. He needed help. That evening, after putting a visibly shaken Clara to bed, he made a decision. He was going to reach out to the only man in perdition he thought he could trust, a man who owed him a debt of gratitude. Elias Vance was an old prospector, a man whose face was a road map of a long and difficult life. He lived in a small, isolated cabin a few miles from Jedediah's ranch, his only companion, a mangy, one-eyed dog. A few years back, Elias had been caught in a flash flood. His leg broken, his life hanging by a thread. Jedediah had found him, had carried him back to his cabin, and had nursed him back to health. Elias had never forgotten. Jedediah rode to Elias's cabin under the cloak of darkness, the moon a sliver of silver in the inky sky. He found the old man, sitting on his porch, a bottle of Atherton whiskey in his hand, his dog at his feet. Jedediah Elias said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "What brings you out to my humble abode at this hour? You look like you've seen a ghost." Jedediah sat down on the steps, the weariness of the past few days settling over him like a shroud. He told Elias everything. The story of Sarah, of her father, of Silas Croft. He laid bare his fears, his desperation, his fierce, protective love for the girl who had become a daughter to him in all but blood. Elias listened in silence, his one good eye fixed on Jedediah's face. When Jedediah had finished, the old prospector took a long pull from his whiskey bottle, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Silas Croft," he said, the name a curse on his lips. "I know the man. He's a snake, a bottom feeder. He'd sell his own mother for a bottle of cheap rotgut." He spat on the ground, a gesture of pure disgust. "I don't know what to do." "Elias?" Jedediah admitted the words, a painful confession. "I can't let him take her. I can't." Elias was silent for a long moment, his gaze lost in the darkness. Then he looked at Jedediah, his one good eye gleaming with a fierce, unexpected light. "You know, son," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial, "this land, it has a way of holding on to its secrets, and sometimes it has a way of protecting its own." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I've been poking around these hills for nigh on 30 years. I've seen things that would make a man's hair stand on end. I've heard stories, old stories from the Apache about a place of refuge, a hidden canyon, a place where the water runs clean and the earth is fertile, a place where a man and his family could disappear, could start anew." Jedediah stared at him, his heart pounding with a new, unfamiliar emotion. Hope. It was a dangerous, seductive thing, a flicker of light in the overwhelming darkness. A hidden canyon. He repeated the words, a breathless whisper. Elias nodded. "It's a long shot, a fool's errand, maybe. But it's a better chance than you've got, sitting here waiting for Croft to come knocking on your door." He stood up, his old bones creaking in protest. He went inside his cabin and returned a moment later with a tattered hand-drawn map. He spread it out on the porch, the lines and symbols illuminated by the faint moonlight. "It ain't much," he said, his gnarled finger tracing a faint, almost invisible line through a series of rugged, impassable-looking mountains. "But it's a start. It's a chance." Jedediah looked at the map, at the faint, hopeful line leading to an unknown destination. It was a gamble, a desperate last-ditch effort. But it was also a choice to fight, to run, to protect the family he had so unexpectedly, so miraculously found. He looked at Elias, his heart full of a gratitude so profound it left him speechless. The old prospector, the man he had once saved, was now offering him a lifeline, a glimmer of hope in the face of an impossible situation. As Jedediah rode back to his cabin, the tattered map tucked safely in his saddlebag, he felt a shift in the wind. The storm was still coming, he knew that, but now for the first time he had a direction. He had a plan. He had a chance. And in the unforgiving, brutal world of the West, a chance was sometimes all a man needed. It was a long way from the dust of perdition to the hope of a hidden canyon, but it was a journey he was willing to take. For Clara, for Sarah, for the miracle he would protect with his last breath. The decision to flee was a heavy one, a silent acknowledgement of their vulnerability. To leave the cabin, the only home Clara had ever known, the place where Jedediah had built a life with Mary, felt like a betrayal of the past. But to stay was to sacrifice the future. The tattered map from Elias was their only testament of faith, a fragile promise of a place untouched by the greed and violence of men like Silas Croft. They began their preparations in secret, under the cloak of darkness. Jedediah worked tirelessly, his movements fueled by a desperate urgency. He packed supplies enough for a long and arduous journey, dried meat flour beans, and as much water as their canteens and barrels could hold. He checked and rechecked his Winchester rifle and his Colt, the cold, hard steel, a grim reminder of the dangers that lay ahead. Sarah, her face a pale, determined mask, packed their meager belongings. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her fear channeled into a focused energy. She gathered Clara's dolls, the small, precious talismans of her childhood, and tucked them safely into a canvas bag. She harvested as much as she could from her miraculous garden, her hands moving with a gentle, almost reverent touch. The vibrant, life-giving plants seemed to droop in her absence, as if sensing the impending departure of their gentle caretaker. Clara, though sensing the undercurrent of tension, was shielded from the true extent of their danger. Jedediah and Sarah told her they were going on an adventure, a long camping trip to a beautiful secret place. Her initial excitement was tempered by a childish sadness at leaving her home. But the promise of a new, exciting world, a world described in hushed, hopeful tones by Sarah, was enough to quell her fears. Elias Vance became their silent, watchful guardian. He would appear at their cabin at odd hours, his one good eye scanning the horizon, his mangy dog, a low, growling sentinel at his side. He brought them supplies he had stumbled upon, a sack of oats for Bess, a new, sturdy water skin, a small, precious bag of coffee. His gruff, cantankerous exterior was a thin veneer over a heart of pure, unadulterated loyalty. They planned to leave on the night of the new moon, the darkness their ally. But fate, as it so often does in the unforgiving West, had other plans. 2 days before their planned departure, a rider appeared on the horizon. It was not Sheriff Brody this time, nor was it the menacing figure of Silas Croft. It was a young man from a neighboring ranch, his face etched with a mixture of fear and excitement. "Jedediah," he shouted, reining in his horse, his voice breathless. "There's a posse forming in Perdition. Sheriff Brody's deputized 12 men. They're heading out to the old abandoned silver mine up in the canyons. They say Silas Croft's holed up there. They're gonna run him out of the territory for good." The news was a jolt, a sudden unexpected reprieve. Jedediah's first reaction was a surge of relief, so profound it almost buckled his knees. Brody, for all his bluster and self-importance, was a man of the law. He was finally doing his job, a posse. Jedediah repeated, his mind racing. "Yes, sir," the young man said, his eyes wide. "The whole town's in an uproar. They say Croft's been causing all sorts of trouble, threatening folks, trying to extort money. Sheriff Brody's had enough." The story was plausible. Croft was a man who attracted trouble like a magnet. A confrontation with the law was inevitable. That night, for the first time in weeks, a fragile sense of hope settled over the small cabin. They postponed their departure, their bags still packed, their supplies ready, but their hearts a little lighter. Perhaps they wouldn't have to run. Perhaps the threat of Silas Croft would be neutralized, a bad memory swallowed by the vast, unforgiving desert. The next day, A strange, almost festive atmosphere hung over the edge of perdition. Men rode by their rifles in their hands, their faces set with a grim, self-important determination. They were part of the posse. A band of ordinary men transformed into agents of justice. They tipped their hats to Jedediah, their earlier pity and derision replaced by a grudging respect. He was, after all, a man who had stood up to Croft, a man who had protected his own. But as the day wore on, a small nagging unease began to creep into Jedediah's mind. Something felt wrong. The posse was too large, the preparations too elaborate for a man like Croft, a lone drifter with no allies and no resources. And Brodie was not a man known for his courage or his decisive action. Why the sudden dramatic show of force? The answer came late that afternoon in the form of Elias Vance. The old prospector rode up to the cabin at a gallop, his face a mask of fury and betrayal. "It's a trap!" He roared, his voice a raw, desperate cry. "It's all a lie." Jedediah and Sarah rushed out of the cabin, their hearts pounding in their chests. "What are you talking about, Elias?" Jedediah demanded. "The posse." Elias spat, his one good eye blazing with a righteous fire. "It ain't for Croft. It's for you." The words hung in the air, a stunning, brutal revelation. "Brodie's in on it." Elias continued, his voice thick with disgust. "Croft's been filling his head with stories about the girl, about her wealthy father. He's promised Brodie a share of the reward money. They ain't going to the silver mine. They're coming here. Tonight." The betrayal was a cold, sharp blade to the gut. Brodie, the man of the law, the man who had offered his empty words of encouragement, had sold them out. The posse, the men who had ridden by with their self-righteous expressions, were not agents of justice but a lynch mob, their greed stoked by the whispers of a snake. There was no time for anger, no time for despair. There was only time for action. "We have to go," Jedediah said, his voice a low, urgent command. "Now!" The frantic, desperate scramble to leave was a blur of motion and fear. They loaded the last of their supplies onto Bess and a small pack mule Elias had brought with him. Jedediah lifted a pale, frightened Clara onto the mare, her small hands clutching the saddle horn. "It's all right, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice a rough, shaky attempt at reassurance. "The adventure is just starting a little early." Elias, his face a grim, determined mask, handed Jedediah the tattered map. "You follow this," he said, his voice firm. "Don't stop for nothing. I'll do what I can to slow 'em down, to buy you some time." "Elias, you can't," Sarah said, her voice full of a desperate concern. "They'll kill you." The old prospector looked at her, his one good eye softening for a moment. "They can try," he said, a wry, humorless smile touching his lips. He looked at Jedediah, a silent understanding passing between them. "You go. You protect that family of yours. You show 'em what a real man is." With a final desperate look at the home they were leaving behind, the life they were abandoning, Jedediah mounted Bess, pulling Sarah up behind him. He took one last look at Elias, a silent, heartfelt thank you to the man who was sacrificing everything for them. They rode out into the encroaching darkness, their hearts a frantic, desperate rhythm against the backdrop of the silent, unforgiving desert. They didn't look back. They couldn't. Behind them lay betrayal, danger, and the dying embers of a life that was no more. Ahead of them lay an unknown, perilous journey, a desperate flight into the heart of the wilderness. The dust of perdition rose behind them, a symbol of the life they were leaving in their wake. But this time it was not the dust of regret, but the dust of a desperate, defiant hope. They were no longer waiting for the storm. They were riding into the heart of it, their only guide, a tattered map, their only weapon, a fierce, unwavering love for each other. The miracle of Sarah had not been a quiet, peaceful thing. It had been a catalyst, a spark that had ignited a firestorm of danger and betrayal. And now, in the heart of that storm, Jedediah Kane, the struggling single dad, was no longer just a rancher. He was a protector, a fugitive, a man on a desperate quest to save the family. He had been given the miracle he would not let them take. The flight from perdition had begun, and the true test of their courage, their resilience, and their love had just started. The flight from perdition was a fever dream, painted against a canvas of brutal, beautiful desolation. Days were a torment of heat and dust, forcing them into the scant shade of rock formations, where the sun beat down relentlessly. Nights were a cold reprieve, spent huddled together under a blanket of stars, so vast and indifferent it threatened to swallow them whole. Their guide was the tattered map from Elias, a fragile creed of hope clutched in Jedediah's hand. Jedediah became a man honed to a fine, sharp edge by vigilance. He was the grim watchman, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his ears attuned to the slightest unnatural sound. The weight of his Winchester rifle was a constant, grim companion. He pushed them onward, driven by a fear so profound it had burned away everything but the primal need to protect his family. Sarah was the quiet, steady heart of their desperate exodus. Where Jedediah was hard-edged, she was resilient, her gentle strength a balm on their raw nerves. She cared for Clara, weaving stories and singing soft lullabies that held the encroaching terror at bay. She managed their dwindling food and water with a pragmatism that belied her youth, ensuring their survival one meager meal at a time. In the saddle behind Jedediah, her presence was a silent reassurance, a reminder of what he was fighting for. And Clara, a child spirit, proving more durable than brittle stone, adapted. For her, the terror was an adventure. She saw not a desolate wasteland, but a world of wonder. Her laughter, when it bubbled up, was a sound of pure defiance, a splash of life in the face of death. She was the seed of their future, the reason the journey, however perilous, had meaning. A week into their flight, their fragile bubble of isolation was nearly pierced. While resting in a hidden arroyo, Jedediah heard it, the distinct, sharp click of a shod horse on stone. His heart seized. Motioning for Sarah and Clara to hide, he crept to the edge of their sanctuary, his rifle raised. Through a screen of withered brush, he saw a lone rider. Silas Croft. He moved with the slow, patient menace of a vulture circling its prey, his eyes fixed on the ground, reading the story of the land. Jedediah's world narrowed to the space between the rifle's sight and Croft's chest. Here was the serpent in their garden, the architect of their misery. A single, clean shot. That's all it would take to end the threat, to purchase their peace with a bullet. His finger tightened on the trigger, the cold metal a temptation. But then a vision of Clara's innocent face, of Sarah's trusting eyes, flooded his mind. To pull the trigger was to become a killer, to let the poison of men like Croft into his own soul. He would protect his family, but he would not sacrifice his own humanity to do it. With a silent, guttural curse, he lowered the Winchester. He held his breath as Croft passed by, so close Jedediah could see the cruel sneer on his face. The man was following a false trail, a ghost of their passing, that would lead him deeper into the wilderness. The immediate danger had passed, but the encounter was a chilling reminder they were being hunted. The close call spurred them on deeper into the rugged mountains that clawed at the sky. The land grew more treacherous, a maze of stone and shadow. Just as their hope began to fray, they found it. Tucked away behind a fissure in a sheer cliff face, so narrow it was almost invisible, was the sanctuary Elias had promised. It was a small hidden valley, a perfect secret world. A clear spring bubbled up from the rock, feeding a stream that cut a ribbon of silver through a meadow of impossibly green grass. Cottonwood trees offered cool, dappled shade, and the air was sweet with the scent of wildflowers. It was a place of impossible peace, a paradise held in the cupped hands of the mountains. Tears of relief streamed down Sarah's face. Jedediah slid from the saddle, his legs trembling with exhaustion and overwhelming gratitude. He had done it. He had brought them home. In this haven they began to heal. The rhythm of their days was no longer dictated by fear, but by creation. The ringing of Jedediah's axe became the valley's heartbeat as he felled trees for a small, sturdy cabin. The scent of turned earth followed Sarah as she planted a new garden, coaxing life from the rich soil with the same gentle magic that had transformed the dust bowl behind their old home. The sound of Clara's laughter echoed through the canyon as she explored their new kingdom. The unspoken love between Jedediah and Sarah finally found its voice in the quiet moments, a shared glance across the fire, a brushing of hands while working side by side. They were no longer a grieving man and a rescued girl, but a husband and wife in all but name, their bond forged in the crucible of their shared ordeal. They were a family whole and complete, sheltered by the towering canyon walls. But peace in the West is often a fleeting dream before a violent awakening. One evening, as twilight bled purple and orange across the sky, their idyllic world was shattered. A single gunshot. It cracked through the serene air, echoing off the stone walls like a prophecy of doom. Jedediah was on his feet in an instant, the builder replaced by the protector. "Get in the cabin," he ordered, his voice a low, hard command. He grabbed his Winchester and crept toward the narrow entrance of the valley, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. Peering through the fissure, he scanned the moonlit landscape. Two figures stood starkly against the skyline. He recognized Croft immediately. The other man, to his sickening disbelief, was Sheriff Brody. They weren't fighting. They were arguing, their angry, guttural whispers carrying on the wind. It was about money, about a reward. Then, in a flash of brutal final movement, Croft drew his peacemaker. The second gunshot was louder, sharper. Sheriff Brody crumpled to the ground, a dark stain spreading across the front of his shirt. Greed had made them partners. Now it had made them enemies. Croft stood over the body for a moment, his chest heaving. Then slowly he lifted his head. He stared directly at the hidden entrance to the valley, a chilling, triumphant smile spreading across his face. He didn't know exactly where they were, but he knew they were here. He had found them. The sanctuary had become a trap. There was nowhere left to run. Standing at the threshold of his new home, Jedediah looked back at the warm light, spilling from the unfinished cabin, where the two people who had remade his world waited. The miracle of Sarah hadn't just saved him from grief. It had given him something to fight for, something to die for. The price of their freedom was blood, and the bill had just come due. The final battle for the canyon and for their lives had begun. In the heart of that hidden canyon, a final desperate battle was waged not just with guns, but with courage, with love, and with an unyielding will to protect what was most precious. The miracle wasn't just Sarah's arrival. It was the strength she awakened in Jedediah, the family they forged in the crucible of the Wild West. Their story is a testament to the enduring power of hope in the face of despair. A reminder that even in the most desolate of landscapes, love can find a way to bloom. It's a story of how an act of kindness, a single impulsive decision, can ripple outwards, transforming lives and redeeming souls. What do you think? Was Jedediah's $50 gamble the best investment a man could ever make? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you were moved by their journey, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and stir the soul. Your support helps us to keep these tales alive.